If you grew up in Brantford, you grew up knowing what the Koehring Waterous plant meant. The brick complex on Market Street South that stretched across 25 acres. The shift whistle you could hear from Eagle Place. The fathers and uncles who walked through those gates every morning and came home smelling of cutting oil and arc welding. At its peak, the plant built 50-ton feller bunchers and hydraulic excavators for the logging camps and pulp mills of northern Canada. Machines that ran in the northern bush for decades. They survived 2 world wars, survived the death of steam, survived 4 ownership changes and the collapse of every other major factory in the city around them. And then, after 148 years of continuous manufacturing in Brantford, the gates closed for the last time. How does the oldest continuously operating manufacturer in Canada simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1. The Blacksmith's Apprentice. The story begins in a Vermont machine shop in the late 1830s, with a young man who'd already run out of luck once and would run out of it again before he found Brantford. Charles Horatio Waterous was born on the 29th of September, 1814, in Burlington, Vermont, the son of Eleazar Waterhouse, a former academy principal who abandoned his wife and children for St. Louis in 1816 and died there. His mother, Emma Johnson, remarried 5 years later to Denson Tripp, a farmer in New Haven, Vermont, and the boy spent his childhood split between summer field work and winter schooling. The standard rhythm of a rural New England upbringing with no money behind it. At 15, in 1829, he was apprenticed to a blacksmith named Thomas Davenport in Brandon, Vermont. Davenport was an unusual master. He was an inventor, restless, brilliant, commercially hopeless. He'd go on to build one of the earliest American electric motors, patent it, and fail to make a cent from it. Waterous's laconic verdict on the man, recorded decades later, was that Davenport was a better inventor than blacksmith. When Davenport's shop went under, Waterous finished his training in a machine shop and spent the next decade drifting through the foundries and ironworks of New England and Buffalo, learning steam, learning casting, learning the hard economics of metalworking in a country that was industrializing faster than most of its entrepreneurs could keep up with. He arrived in Brantford in 1848. The man who recruited him north was Philip Cady Van Brocklin, another New Englander, who'd built a small foundry on Dalhousie Street in 1844 to make stoves, plows, and fireplace accessories. Van Brocklin's operation was, by any honest measure, primitive. The original sketch from 1845 shows a power plant consisting of a single horse plodding in circles in the basement, hitched to a sweep pole that turned a vertical shaft. A triangle mounted in the building's tower was rung to signal the start and end of the workday. 25 men, $30,000 of annual product, a horse in the basement. Waterous probably brought little or no capital. What he brought was 15 years of metalworking fluency and the instinct of a man who'd watched one employer after another go bankrupt and intended not to repeat the experience. Van Brocklin made him a partner for a 1/4 share. With a third man, an Englishman named Thomas Winter, they converted the foundry from stoves to steam engines. And in 1849, Waterous and his partners fitted the first steam engine of its kind in that part of Upper Canada, a 25-horsepower direct-action unit, built entirely by hand, installed to power Van Brocklin and Meade's sawmill. The partnership changed names the way small 19th-century firms did: Van Brocklin, Winter and Company, then Gould, Bennett and Company, then Ganson, Waterous and Cohen. But by 1854, Waterous had bought out Van Brocklin entirely. By 1864, he was running the foundry himself, partnered with George H. Wilkes, a local manager whose own previous foundry had failed. Sales rose from $120,000 in 1870 to $220,000 by 1875. In 1874, the firm incorporated under Ontario's Limited Liability Act as Waterous Engine Works Company Limited. The incorporation brought in a name that mattered in Brantford more than almost any other: Ignatius Cockshut, the merchant prince, whose agricultural implement dynasty was already reshaping the city. Cockshut's son, James G. Cockshut, was made president. Charles Horatio Waterous stayed on as general manager. The 2 greatest manufacturing families in Brantford were now interlocked, the cockshuts providing capital and connections, the Waterous name carrying the engineering. The national policy tariffs of 1879, Sir John A. Macdonald's protective wall around Canadian manufacturing, are conventionally credited with the explosion of Ontario industry in the 1880s. In Waterous's case, the firm had already doubled its sales before those tariffs arrived. What the tariff wall did was accelerate a trajectory that was already steep. By 1883, the workforce had grown from those original 25 hands to 180 men, and annual product had climbed to $285,000. The horse in the basement was a memory. The foundry on Dalhousie Street was running on steam that Waterous had designed himself. Charles Horatio Waterous died in Brantford on the 10th of February, 1892, aged 77. He'd been a patriarchal, technically obsessive, self-made mechanic who imported skilled workers across the American border, built his company by hand, and produced 4 Brantford mayors across 2 generations of his family. His brother-in-law, David June, had supplied the rights to manufacture the Champion vertical engine in Canada in 1877, the basis for Waterous's spectacular growth in agricultural steam. The Waterous family would remain in Brantford for another half-century, running the works and the city in roughly equal measure. His son, Charles Horatio Waterous Jr., served as mayor in 1905 and 1906, and his grandson, Reginald J. Waterous, held the office from 1938 to 1940. A Vermont blacksmith's apprentice had built a dynasty on the Grand River. It would take 100 years and 4 different foreign owners to tear it apart. Chapter 2. Fire Engines and Foreign Orders. The Waterous engine works that Charles Horatio left behind in 1892 was no longer a foundry. It was a full-spectrum heavy manufacturer, and its catalog read like a survey of everything the late Victorian economy required: steam engines, sawmills, boilers, stone crushers, road rollers, hoisting engines, waterworks pumping equipment, pulp beaters, pulpwood chippers, coal handling machinery, and the product that would carry the Waterous name into the 20th century and across the border: fire engines. The fire engine business had started in the early 1870s, when the company designed horse-drawn steam fire engines with a Waterous boiler driving the pump. By 1886, the business was strong enough to justify a second factory, not in Brantford, but in St. Paul, Minnesota, at 62 South Robert Street, built specifically to manufacture firefighting equipment for the American market. That Minnesota operation would outlive the Brantford works by decades. It survives today as the Waterous Company, a subsidiary of American Cast Iron Pipe, making fire pumps and hydrants in South St. Paul, a 210,000-square-foot factory that still carries the name of a Vermont blacksmith who arrived in Brantford with nothing in 1848. The straight-line sawmill, thousands of which were put into operation around the world, was a Waterous design that became a standard portable mill. A portable sawmill won first prize at the 1875 Exposition of Santiago, Chile. Another won a medal at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. The first Canadian steam traction engine was built by Waterous in 1881. By 1896, the firm was building 18-horsepower traction engines, copying Buffalo Pitt's gearing. At the 1906 Dominion Exhibition in Halifax, the company won the gold medal for its 600-gallon fire engine and gasoline engine. In 1909, New York City purchased its first self-propelled fire engine from Waterous of Brantford, Ontario. A company that had started with a horse in the basement was now selling firefighting equipment to the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. The old Dalhousie Street Works, the original Van Brocklin foundry, was sold to the city of Brantford for $40,000 in 1895. After a long detour as the Federal Post Office, that building is, today, Brantford's City Hall. Waterous purchased a 25-acre site on Market Street South and built the brick factory complex that would define the company for almost a century. Assembly shops, a foundry, a boiler plant, a paint shop, an office block, and rail sidings connecting the works to the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway freight yards. By 1916, the Brantford Works was producing, among scores of other items, mining machinery, woodworking planers, portable sawmills, locomotive and marine boilers, refuse burners, pulp beaters, coal handling equipment, and the full repertoire of Edwardian heavy industry. The factory was a small city within a small city, and the smoke from its stacks was visible from across the Grand River. The two world wars pulled Waterous into the national effort the way they pulled every Canadian manufacturer. During the First World War, the works supplied boilers, marine engines, and munition support. Two great-grandsons of the founder, Hewitt Logan Waterous, born in 1915, and Charles Horatio Waterous II, born in 1916, worked as draftsmen at the company before the Second World War. Both enlisted in the Royal Canadian Artillery. Hewitt came home in 1945 with the rank of captain. Charles did not come home at all. Lieutenant Charles Horatio Waterous II, serving with the 1st Anti-Tank Regiment, was killed on the 26th of July, 1943, in Sicily, ambushed by a German machine gun position while scouting on a motorbike. He was 27 years old. He is buried in the Ajira Canadian War Cemetery, in a grave that carries the name of a Brantford manufacturing dynasty, 4 generations deep. By 1926, with steam in retreat, the company shortened its name to Waterous Limited. The fire engine business had been transferred entirely to the St. Paul Works. The last complete piece of fire apparatus was built in Brantford in 1929. What remained in Brantford was road rollers, brick-making machinery, stone crushers, and, most critically for everything that would follow, pulp and paper equipment, grinders, screens, beaters, vats. The pulp and paper business would become the bridge between the old Waterous and the new identity that a Milwaukee buyer was about to impose. In 1944, Waterous Limited marked its 100th year of continuous operation with a celebration for employees and their families, one of the first Canadian companies to reach the century mark. It was a genuine achievement, 100 years of continuous manufacturing in one Ontario river town, through Confederation, 2 world wars, the national policy tariffs and their slow erosion, the Depression, and the transformation of Canadian industry from steam to internal combustion. The Waterous name meant something in Brantford. It meant steady work and a paycheck you could count on. 3 years later, in April 1947, the Waterous family sold the company. The buyers were a group of Toronto business people operating as modern tool works. The reasons aren't documented in public sources, but the disappearance of steam, the death of the founding generation, and the national post-war wave of industrial consolidation are explanation enough. Reginald J. Waterous, the last family patriarch, a former Brantford mayor, had watched his cousin die in Sicily, and his grandfather's product line shrink to a fraction of what it had been. The sale ended a century of family ownership. It was the first of 5 decisions, none of them taken in Brantford, that would kill the plant. Chapter 3. The Milwaukee Connection. Modern Tool Works held the company for 6 years. In September 1953, they sold it to the Koehring Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Philip Koehring had founded his company in 1907 to manufacture steam-driven portable concrete mixers. By the early 1950s, the renamed Koehring Company had grown into one of the major American makers of cable cranes, excavators, drag lines, and heavy construction equipment, a Milwaukee industrial operation with facilities in Canada, Cuba, the Netherlands, and Japan. Koehring wanted Canadian market access, then still protected by tariffs. Waterous gave it a Canadian incorporated platform, an existing dealer base, and the pulp and paper machinery business. The Brantford operation was renamed Koehring Waterous Limited. The logic was clean. Koehring delivered what it promised: capital investment, access to American product technology, and the hydraulic excavator line that the old Waterous Works had never built. The Brantford plant grew under its new owners through the late 1950s and 1960s, but the price was permanent branch plant status, a Brantford factory answering to a Milwaukee head office, its future dependent on decisions made by people who'd never walked the floor. The transformation of the plant was swift and deliberate. In 1957, Koehring closed the foundry, dropped the sawmill equipment line, and sold off the boiler products business, the inheritance of Charles Horatio Waterous, stripped away in a single year. In 1959, A new addition to the Market Street factory was built to accommodate the production of large forestry operations equipment. By 1964, the remaining foundry operations were shut down entirely and replaced with a metal forming and welding plant. The old Waterous was gone. In its place stood something new, a heavy equipment works that built hydraulic excavators, cable cranes, drum chippers, debarkers, and, increasingly, the forestry machines that would define the Brantford plant for the next 3 decades. The man who shaped much of what Koehring Waterous became was John Koehring. He'd gone to work for Marathon Corporation in Northern Ontario in 1951 and joined Koehring, where he became integral in the development of the shortwood harvester, the accumulating shear, and the disc saw, 3 innovations that mechanized the Canadian logging industry. Koehring didn't just design machines. He trained an entire generation of Brantford engineers: Robin Barker, Stan Barra, Ken Harrison, Tony Iorochi, Kevin Keats, Phil Ricotta, Grant Somerville, who learned their craft on the Market Street floor and carried it with them when the plant died. That circle of engineers would matter enormously later. But in the early 1960s, they were young men learning to build machines that could cut, strip, and chip boreal timber at a scale that would have astonished the horse-powered foundry of 1845. Chapter 4. Iron in the Woods. The machines that rolled out of the Market Street South works through the 1960s and 1970s were not delicate instruments. They were built for the boreal forest, for black spruce stands in Northern Ontario, for the frozen logging roads of Quebec's Côte-Nord, for the pulp mill yards where entire trainloads of timber were reduced to uniform 25mm chips. A Koehring Waterous feller buncher weighed upward of 50 tons at full crawler-mounted weight, powered by an 8V92 Detroit diesel engine that you could hear idling from half a kilometer away in cold air. The hydraulic excavators, the 466, the 505, the 1066, the 1466, badged Koehring Waterous for the Canadian market, swung buckets that could lift a cubic meter of rock and earth in a single pass. The drum chippers, installed in pulp mills from Cape Breton to British Columbia, reduced spruce and pine logs into chips at volumes that kept the digesters fed around the clock. And the shortwood harvesters, John Koehring's signature creation, could fell a tree, delimit, and bucket into 4-foot lengths in a single mechanical sequence, replacing a crew of men with chainsaws and skidders. Building these machines was loud, physical work. The welding stations on the Market Street floor ran hot enough in summer to soak through a man's coveralls by mid-morning. In winter, the loading docks on the east side of the plant, open to the freight yards and the wind off the Grand River, were cold enough to stiffen your fingers around a wrench inside of 10 minutes. The contrast was a running joke on the floor. You could sweat through your shirt at one end of the building and see your breath at the other. The paint shop smelled of primer and solvent. The machine shop smelled of cutting oil and hot metal shavings. The assembly bays, where the big crawlers took shape, smelled of hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel and the particular ozone tang of arc welding. The color, by the 1970s, was Koehring red-yellow, a livery that logging crews across northern Canada knew on sight. The workflow moved from raw steel plate and castings through cutting, forming, welding, machining, painting, and final assembly, a sequence that could take weeks for a large excavator or feller buncher. Overhead cranes moved components between stations. Rail sidings on the east side of the plant connected to the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway freight yards, and finished machines were loaded onto flat cars for the trip north, to Kapuskasing, to Hearst, to Marathon, to Baie-Comeau, to the 100 logging operations and pulp mills scattered across the Canadian Shield. Highland Pulp of Cape Breton purchased a Koehring shortwood harvester in 1970 and ran it in the northern Nova Scotia woods for 19 consecutive years, retiring it only in 1989, the year the plant that built it was being handed to its final owner. Marathon Corporation in Northern Ontario was an early and loyal customer. Machines were exported to Scandinavia and Northern Europe, where the boreal conditions matched. The American South, with its pine plantations and growing pulp industry, was another market. And across Canada, Koehring Waterous equipment appeared in municipal waterworks, construction sites, and highway projects. The excavators, bearing a name that was half Brantford and half Milwaukee, stamped on machines that were entirely built on Market Street South. Chapter 5. Eagle Place. The men who built those machines lived, many of them, within walking distance of the plant. Eagle Place, the neighborhood south of the downtown core, bracketed by the Grand River and the rail lines, was Koehring waterous territory, the way Cockshut country was, a few blocks east, and Massey country was a few blocks north. The houses were modest, post-war bungalows and pre-war frame houses on streets named for the men who'd platted them in the 19th century. A man could punch in at the Market Street gate at 7 in the morning and be home for supper by 4:30, his steel-toed boots still warm from the shop floor. The workforce was drawn from the same immigration waves that had built Brantford's industrial base since the 1850s. The original core was British and Scottish. Men like Thomas Hunter, born in Cowdenbeath, Scotland, in 1925, brought to Brantford as a 3-year-old in 1928, who spent his working life at Koehring Waterous and built his house at 23 Morton Avenue with his brother, Sheik, and a circle of fellow workers from the plant. That kind of cooperative house building, factory men helping each other raise walls and lay foundations on evenings and weekends, defined the inner Brantford working class. You didn't hire a contractor. You called the men you worked beside on the shop floor, and they came with their tools, and you did the same for them when their turn arrived. After the war, the floor changed. Dutch-trained craftsmen arrived, men like Ralph Sudervliet, who'd learned his trade in Europe and retrained in Canada. Italian-Canadian families settled in Eagle Place and the surrounding neighborhoods, bringing a new generation of machinists and assemblers to the Koehring Waterous payroll. Polish-Canadian workers, Hungarian Canadians, Portuguese Canadians, each wave arriving to fill the floor as the plant expanded into forestry equipment through the 1960s. The accents on the shop floor at lunchtime were as layered as the city itself. English and Italian, and Dutch and Polish, the conversation moving between languages depending on who was sitting at which bench in the break room, over sandwiches and thermoses of coffee, and, for the older men, cigarettes smoked under the no-smoking signs that everyone, including the foreman, pretended not to see. By the 1960s and 1970s, Koehring Waterous was one of the pillar industries of a city that had more of them per capita than almost anywhere in Ontario. Within a kilometer of the Market Street Works stood the Cockshut Plough Company, the Verity Plough Company, an affiliate of Massey Harris, Adams Wagon Company, and Sternson Chemicals. Massey Ferguson's Brantford operations employed thousands. Scarf & Company, Pratt & Letchworth, and a constellation of smaller manufacturers filled the industrial lands along the rail corridors. Brantford was, by some measures, the third largest manufacturing center for exported goods in Canada. Locals called it the Birmingham of Canada, and in the 1960s, the comparison wasn't absurd. The smoke from a dozen plants hung over the Grand River Valley on still mornings. The Department of Health reported in 1960 that smoke and dust pollution in Brantford was worse than in Toronto. And that was with Koehring Waterous's old foundry still contributing its share before its 1964 closure. The city that the factories built was not glamorous. It was a paycheck city. A place where a man with a trade and a willingness to show up at 7 in the morning could buy a house, raise a family, and retire with a pension. The union at Koehring Waterous, its identity unconfirmed in public records, though Library and Archives Canada preserves a 1966 strikes and lockouts file confirming the workforce was organized by at least that date, provided the floor with collective bargaining, grievance procedures, and the knowledge that the man standing next to you at the press had someone standing behind him. The precise headcount at the Koehring Waterous peak isn't in the open record, but the plant's status as one of Brantford's 3 or 4 largest employers, alongside Massey Ferguson, Cockshut, and White Farm Equipment, is not in dispute. Several hundred unionized production workers, plus a substantial engineering staff, occupied the 25-acre Market Street site at its busiest. And Brantford was the telephone city, the name stamped on its identity with a pride that had nothing to do with factories, but everything to do with the conviction that great things happened here. Alexander Graham Bell's family had moved to Brantford in 1870. Bell credited the idea of the telephone to his work at his father's home at Melville House in Tutela Heights in 1874. The first long-distance telephone transmission was made between Brantford and Paris, Ontario, on the 3rd of August, 1876. Canada's first telephone factory opened in Brantford in 1879. A city that had given the world the telephone and sold fire engines to New York City and exported sawmills to Chile was not a city that expected to be abandoned. Chapter 6. The Highest Ridge. If you could have stood on the roof of the Koehring Waterous office block on Market Street South in the late 1970s, looking east across the freight yards to the Cockshut lands, north to Massey Ferguson, south toward the Grand River, you'd have seen a city that still believed in itself. The parking lots were full, the rail sidings were busy, the cranes in the assembly bays were moving. The Canadian pulp and paper industry was investing heavily in the mechanization of its woodland operations, and the machines it needed, the shortwood harvesters, the feller bunchers, the drum chippers, were being designed and built on this floor by engineers who'd learned their trade from John Koehring, and assemblers who'd learned theirs from the men who came before them. It was a small golden age, carrying Waterous's share of a larger one. Forestry was done on a grand scale in those years, large company-owned operations with fleets of heavy machines and unionized workforces living in remote, well-outfitted camps strung across the Canadian Shield from northern Ontario to Labrador. The Koehring Waterous machine philosophy matched that era perfectly. Big iron for big customers. The 618 and 628 feller bunchers, the shortwood harvesters, the K3F forwarder, the log loaders and skidders and accumulating shears. These were machines built for companies that thought in terms of thousands of hectares and millions of board feet. The product line was respected. The engineering was proven. The customers kept ordering. But the late 1970s were the highest ridge before the descent, and from the top of that ridge, the signs were already visible for anyone who knew where to look. The tariff wall that had kept Canadian manufacturing viable since John A. Macdonald's national policy, the wall that had brought Koehring to Brantford in the first place, seeking a Canadian incorporated platform inside a protected market, was the subject of increasingly serious political discussion. Across the border, American manufacturers were watching, and in Japan, Komatsu and Hitachi were building hydraulic excavators that were lighter, cheaper, and increasingly competitive with anything Milwaukee or Brantford could offer. The Koehring parent, meanwhile, was not well. The crane and excavator division that had once been the company's core was losing ground, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The forestry equipment business in Brantford was profitable. The rest of the empire was bleeding. And in a conglomerate, the healthy division doesn't get to secede. It gets dragged down with the rest, or it gets sold to someone who sees it as a line item rather than a legacy. The parking lot on Market Street South was still full. The shift whistle still blew. The red-yellow machines still rolled onto flat cars bound for the northern bush. But the ground under all of it, the tariff protection, the parent company's health, the structure of the Canadian logging industry itself, was shifting in ways that no one on the Brantford floor had been asked about, and no one in Milwaukee was inclined to explain. Chapter 7. The border opens. The first crack wasn't in the plant. It was in the market the plant served. Through the 1980s, the large vertically integrated pulp and paper companies that had been Koehring Waterous's core customers began divesting their own woodland operations. The economics had shifted. Maintaining a company-owned logging fleet, the camps, the crews, the heavy machines, the union contracts, was expensive. Smaller private logging contractors could do the same work with fewer overheads, running lighter equipment with non-union crews. Grant Somerville, who'd trained under John Koehring on the Market Street floor and would later help build Tigercat, saw it clearly. The decline of the Canadian pulp and paper industry led to the demise of company-owned and operated forestry operations, and with them, the market for the large machines Brantford was building. Koehring Waterous had built its business on big iron for big customers. The customers were getting smaller. The iron wasn't. At the same time, the hydraulic excavator market, the other leg of the Brantford business, was being overrun. Komatsu, Hitachi, and Kobelco of Japan, joined through the 1980s by Daewoo and Samsung of Korea, were producing excavators that were technically sophisticated, competitively priced, and available in volumes that a single Brantford plant couldn't match. The Koehring parent in Milwaukee had been losing ground in construction equipment for years, The crane and excavator division was hemorrhaging money, roughly $1 million a month for 5 consecutive years, before the whole business was finally sold off in 1987. $1 million a month. $60 million of losses draining through the corporate structure, while the Brantford forestry division was still turning a profit and still shipping machines north. The healthy limb attached to a dying body. And then the wall came down. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement was signed on the 2nd of January 1988 and took effect on the 1st of January 1989. It didn't close the Koehring Waterous plant that day. What it did was remove the logic that had brought Koehring to Brantford in the first place, the tariff barrier that made a Canadian-incorporated plant necessary to serve the Canadian market. With the tariffs disappearing on a schedule, the question facing every American parent company with a Canadian branch plant became brutally simple. Why maintain 2 facilities when one will do? The Brantford and District Labor Council recorded the consequence without euphemism. Multinational companies who had established branch plants in the area to serve the Canadian market began to rationalize their Brantford operations out of existence by transferring production and exploiting the excess capacity of their American and Mexican operations. Brantford was already wounded when the Free Trade Agreement arrived. Massey Ferguson, the largest single employer in the city, had been dying in public since the early 1980s. Its successor, Massey Combines Corporation, spun off in 1985 under Victor Rice's reorganization, collapsed by 1988. White Farm Equipment closed in 1985. Together, those 2 firms had employed over 7,000 workers in a city of 80,000. Brantford's unemployment rate hit 22% by the end of 1981. The Koehring Waterous plant was still running through all of this, still shipping feller bunchers and drum chippers to the northern bush. But it was running inside a city that had already lost its 2 biggest employers and was about to lose the tariff protection that justified every branch plant within its borders. The combination was lethal: a shrinking domestic market for large forestry equipment, a parent company bleeding money in its core business, Japanese and Korean competitors taking the excavator market, a free trade agreement removing the tariff rationale for Canadian branch plants, a recession deepening across Ontario, a high Canadian dollar making exports more expensive, and a city already reeling from 7,000 lost jobs. Any one of those forces would have pressured the plant. Together, they were a sequence of waves hitting a seawall that was already cracked. Chapter 8. 5 decisions, none of them made in Brantford. The plant didn't die of 1 wound. It died of 5, inflicted over 45 years by men in Toronto, Milwaukee, Hanover, Woodstock, and Helsinki, in that order. Each decision had its own logic. Each one made sense to the person who signed it, and each one moved the Brantford works 1 step closer to the dumpster. The first decision was the Waterous families. In April 1947, Reginald J. Waterous, grandson of the founder, former mayor, the last of the line, signed the company over to a group of Toronto business people operating as Modern Tool Works. 103 years of family ownership ended with a signature. The reasons aren't in the public record, but they don't need to be. The steam business was gone. The wartime generation was exhausted. Reginald's cousin, Charles Horatio Waterous II, was buried in Sicily. The post-war wave of consolidation was sweeping across Canadian manufacturing, and the Waterous family, like dozens of other founding families across Ontario, decided they'd had enough. The sale severed the ownership tether between the plant and the city. From that day forward, the factory on Market Street South belonged to people who didn't live within sight of it. The second decision was Modern Tool Works. In September 1953, after holding the company for just 6 years, they sold it to the Koehring Company of Milwaukee. This wasn't a betrayal. Koehring invested in the plant, brought in the hydraulic excavator line, funded the 1959 forestry equipment expansion, and gave the Brantford Works a product range it could never have developed alone. For 25 years, the Milwaukee connection worked. But the price was branch plant status, a Brantford factory whose survival depended entirely on the priorities of an American parent. When the parent was healthy, the branch thrived. When the parent began to fail, the branch had no voice in its own rescue and no autonomy to chart a different course. The third decision was the one that broke the structure. In 1980, the Koehring Company was acquired by AMCA International, a Hanover, New Hampshire conglomerate that already owned Bomag, Menck, Clyde Iron, and a portfolio of heavy equipment brands. AMCA appointed Vincent L. Martin, formerly head of its crane operations, to run the entire crane and excavator portfolio, including the Brantford forestry and pulp mill business. For 5 years, the Koehring Crane and Excavator division lost nearly $1 million a month. The losses were not in Brantford, but they were in the same corporate ledger, and when AMCA decided to exit, the entire Koehring structure was carved up and sold for parts. The carving was clinical. In early 1986, Vincent L. Martin and Mark Train formed Jason Incorporated and bought 3 AMCA castoffs, including the core Koehring construction equipment business, in a leveraged buyout worth $53 million. In 1987, Randolph W. Lentz's Northwest Engineering Company bought the Koehring Cranes and Excavators division and Benton Engineering for $21.9 million, a fraction of what the business had been worth a decade earlier. Lentz would rename his company Terex Corporation. The Koehring, Lorraine, and Bantam trade names were discontinued by 1988. A Milwaukee company that had been building heavy equipment since 1907 was dismantled in 2 years. What remained after the dismantling, the specialty forestry and pulp mill operations at Brantford, was an orphan. AMCA sold it to the only buyer who wanted it. The fourth decision landed the Brantford plant in the hands of Timberjack Inc. of Woodstock, Ontario. The match looked natural. Timberjack was a Canadian forestry equipment maker, founded in Woodstock in 1947 by Weston A. McGill, Vernon B. King, and Bob Simons, originally building articulated 4-wheel drive skidders. The Timberjack brand name hadn't emerged until 1965. The company had been owned by Eaton Corporation for 2 decades before its own management bought it back in 1984 through Sequoia Associates for approximately $26 million. In 1988, Timberjack acquired the Brantford forestry operations from the wreckage of AMCA's Koehring, 2 Ontario forestry equipment makers, 30 kilometers apart on Highway 401. It should have been a merger. It turned out to be an absorption. The fifth decision was made in Helsinki. In 1989, Sequoia Associates and Timberjack's management sold the company to Rauma Repola Oy of Finland for approximately $120 million. Rauma Repola was assembling, through acquisitions of Sweden's Kockums, OSA, and Brun System, and Finland's Lokomo, the world's largest forestry equipment portfolio. The global scale was real. So was the redundancy. With Timberjack's own plant in Woodstock and the Koehring Waterous plant in Brantford producing overlapping product lines just 30 kilometers apart, the arithmetic was simple. One plant could do the work of 2. The newer, better-positioned Woodstock plant would stay. The older, more expensive Brantford plant, the one with 148 years of history behind it, would close. On the 1st of January, 1991, Rauma Repola merged with Finnish paper mill giant United Paper Mills to form Repola Corporation. The metals and engineering operations were assembled into Rauma Corporation, of which the renamed FMG Timberjack was a subsidiary. Production at the Market Street Works was gradually relocated to Woodstock through 1991. The engineers on the Brantford floor, men who'd spent their careers designing feller bunchers and shortwood harvesters, watched their drawings being packed for a plant they'd never worked in, 30 kilometers up the highway. Each of the 5 decisions had its defenders. The Waterous family was tired and grieving. Modern Tool Works was flipping an asset. Koehring invested before it bled out. AMCA cut its losses. Timberjack consolidated. Rauma Repola rationalized. Every step made sense on a spreadsheet. The sum of them was the death of a plant that had been running since 1844. The oldest continuously operating manufacturer in Canada. Killed not by market failure, but by the accumulated logic of 5 ownership changes, each one moving the center of gravity further from the floor where the machines were built. Chapter 9. The Dumpster. The closure was announced on the 6th of October, 1992. By then, the plant was already nearly empty. Skidder, winch, and tree harvesting equipment production had been the last activity on the Market Street floor. and it had been transferred to Woodstock in stages through 1991. The announcement was a formality, a press release confirming what the workers already knew, what the empty bays and the idle cranes had been telling them for months. In February 1993, the auctioneer came. Lots of plant machinery passed under the hammer: lathes, presses, welding gear, overhead cranes, jigs, fixtures, completed and partial machines. The buyers were dispersed across North American forestry and salvage markets. A feller buncher that had been assembled by men who lived in Eagle Place was sold to someone who'd never heard of Brantford, and then someone threw the records into a dumpster. Not the machines, not the tooling, the records, the corporate minutes, the order books, the insurance appraisals, the letters patent, the deeds and mortgages, the financial ledgers, the brochures. 1,773 engineering drawings, dated 1894 to 1931. 402 glass plate negatives, 171 negatives, 384 photographic prints spanning 1880 to 1960. 148 years of institutional memory, the paper trail of every decision, every product, every worker who'd ever punched in at the Market Street gate, dumped into a bin behind the building like scrap. A retired employee named Roy Belshaw saw it happening. Belshaw was a lifelong Waterous and Koehring Waterous man. He'd spent his working life on the Market Street floor. He asked Timberjack for permission to take the records home. Permission was granted. The company that was throwing away 148 years of history had no objection to a retired machinist loading it into his car. Belshaw kept the collection at his house in Brantford for 15 years. Researchers and collectors contacted him for photographs and drawings, and he fielded the requests from his living room. The unofficial archivist of a company that no longer existed, working from boxes stacked in a house on a residential street. He died in 2008. His daughter, Linda Beatty of Uxbridge, Ontario, offered the collection to the Canada Science and Technology Museum in March 2009. It was certified as cultural property in 2015. It is now accession AS0095, the Roy Belshaw Waterous Collection, held at Ingenium in Ottawa. The engineering drawings, the glass plate negatives, the photographic prints, the paper memory of a company that was born in 1844 and died in 1992, rescued from a dumpster by a man who couldn't bear to watch it disappear. In 1994, the brick factory complex on Market Street South came down. The assembly shops, the 1959 forestry equipment expansion, the office block, the loading docks where Tom Hunter and his brother Cheek and their workmates had loaded flat cars bound for the northern bush. All of it demolished. In March 1994, the site was sold to the Empire Company, parent of Sobeys, for redevelopment as a shopping plaza. Chapter 10. What the city lost. Koehring Waterous did not die alone. It died inside a catastrophe. Between 1985 and 1996, Brantford lost White Farm Equipment, Massey Combines Corporation, Spalding, Crown Electrical Manufacturing, Editech, Trail Mobile, Koehring Waterous, American Healthcare Manufacturing, Keeprite, 765 jobs in January 1994 alone. BASF, TRW Automotive Electronics Group, Innova Envelope, and Harding Carpets. Plant after plant, year after year. The Brantford and District Labor Council recorded the cascade in language that didn't bother softening the blow. Thousands of Brantford workers thrown out of work. In 1992, 27,500 people used the Brantford Food Bank, in a city of 80,000. 1 in 3. By March 1993, the official unemployment rate stood at 14.7%. On the 3rd of October, 1993, the New York Times placed Brantford on its front page. Clyde H. Farnsworth, the paper's Toronto correspondent, filed a dispatch from a city he treated as the emblem of what free trade had done to Canadian manufacturing. The story ran under a dateline that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Brantford, Ontario, on the front page of the world's most important newspaper, not for what it had built, but for what it had lost. The political leadership at the time of the Koehring Waterous closure, Mayor Bob Taylor, MPP Brad Ward of the NDP, MP Derek Blackburn of the NDP, Premier Bob Ray, left no public record of a specific intervention to save the plant. No quoted statement from any of them on Koehring Waterous appears in the open record. There was no organized Save the Plant campaign. No dramatic last stand of the kind that made headlines in other deindustrializing communities. The closure was treated as one of a cascade. One more plant in a city that was running out of plants. The workers scattered the way workers scatter when a factory closes in a small Ontario city with no replacement employer waiting. Some found work in other trades. Some drove to Hamilton or Kitchener or Toronto. Some couldn't. A man in his 50s with 30 years of experience welding Feller buncher frames doesn't walk into a service economy job. The skills that had built Koehring Waterous machines, the ability to read engineering drawings, to set up a CNC lathe, to weld structural steel to spec in a crawl space under a 50-ton chassis, were skills that had no local buyer. But a handful of those men, the engineers, the designers, the men who'd trained under John Koehring and spent their careers turning his ideas into steel, saw what was coming before the closure was announced. In late 1991, Ken McDonald of McDonald Steel approached Tony Iorochi, a Koehring Waterous engineering and customer service veteran of more than 20 years, with a proposal to design and build log skidders at a new company. Tiger Cat Equipment Inc. was incorporated as a Canadian corporation on the 20th of January 1992, 9 months before the Koehring Waterous closure was officially announced. The first Tiger Cat 726 Feller buncher was built in 1992 at McDonald Steel's facility in Cambridge, Ontario. Ken Harrison, who'd run technical publications at Koehring Waterous for 2 decades, joined Tiger Cat in July 1992. John Koehring himself came across. Robin Barker, Stan Bira, Kevin Keats, Phil Ricotta, Grant Somerville, the generation Koehring had trained, followed. Tiger Cat was, in everything but name, the engineering DNA of Koehring Waterous, transplanted 30 kilometers down the Grand River. It purchased its current site in Paris, Ontario, in 1995. In February 2024, the county of Brant celebrated the opening of Iorochi Boulevard in Paris, a street named for the man who'd walked out of a dying plant and helped build something new. But here is what Tiger Cat was not. It was not a rescue. The engineers who founded Tiger Cat were a fraction of the Koehring Waterous workforce. The hundreds of unionized production workers, the welders, the assemblers, the machinists, the painters, the men who'd built their houses in Eagle Place with help from the men they worked beside, were not, in the main, the people running Tiger Cat in 2026. The engineering culture survived. The community that had sustained the plant for 148 years did not. Chapter 11. The Parking Lot. The site today is called Brantford Common, 50 Market Street South. A fully tenanted shopping plaza, 94,316 square feet of gross leasable area, anchored by Freshco. The LCBO is there. Dollarama, Popeyes, Tim Hortons, Boston Pizza, the beer store. Across Market Street stands the Brantford Civic Center. There is no plaque. There is no heritage marker. There is no trace, anywhere on the site, that a factory operated here for nearly a century. The Charles Horatio Waterous's successors built fire engines and steam traction engines and shortwood harvesters on this ground. That John Koehring designed the machines that mechanized the Canadian logging industry in a drafting room that is now, roughly, the produce aisle of a discount grocery store. In 2010, the city expropriated and demolished 41 historic downtown buildings on Colborne Street, one of the longest blocks of pre-Confederation architecture in Canada, for renewal that has yet to fully materialize. By 2017, Brantford recorded the highest rate of emergency room visits for opioid poisoning of any city in Ontario, nearly 99 visits per 100,000 people. The figure climbed higher before falling. The Telephone City's population in 2021 was 104,000, only modestly higher than it had been 40 years earlier, while the rest of southern Ontario had boomed around it. What survives of Waterous is scattered and quiet. The law firm, Waterous Holden Amy Hitchin, still operates in Brantford, founded by Reginald J. Waterous in 1921. The Waterous Company in South St. Paul still makes fire pumps and hydrants. Tiger Cat International, in Cambridge and Paris, still builds forestry equipment with the knowledge that John Kurelek and Tony Iarocci carried out of the Market Street Gate. The Roy Belshaw collection sits in climate-controlled storage at Ingenium in Ottawa. 1,773 engineering drawings, 402 glass plate negatives, the entire paper memory of a company that was born when there was a horse in the basement and died when there was a Finnish conglomerate in Helsinki. Certified cultural property of Canada. Rescued from a dumpster by a retired machinist who couldn't let it go. A set of fireplace andirons from Van Brocklin's original 1845 foundry is displayed on a shelf at Brantford City Hall. The same building that was once the Dalhousie Street Works. The same building where Charles Horatio Waterous fitted his first steam engine by hand in 1849. The Brantford Fire Hall No. 2 on Fairview Drive preserves a Ronald Waterous steam fire engine. And somewhere in the archives of the Canada Science and Technology Museum, there are glass plate negatives of machines that no longer exist, built by men who are no longer alive, in a factory that is now a parking lot next to a Freshco. Brantford sits on the Haldimand Tract, land granted by the British Crown in 1784 to the Six Nations of the Grand River, 6 miles on either bank from source to mouth. The Grand River still runs through the city the way it always has, past the site where Van Brocklin built his foundry, and Waterous built his dynasty, and Koehring built its machines, and Timberjack threw it all in a bin. The river doesn't know the difference. It carries the same water past the same banks, indifferent to what was built on its shores and what was torn down. The factory is gone. The family is gone. The smoke and the noise and the shift whistle, and the men walking home to Eagle Place with metal shavings in their cuffs. All of it, gone. What's left is a shopping plaza, a law firm, a fire pump factory in Minnesota, a forestry company on the same river, and a collection of old drawings in a government archive, the remnants of something that lasted 148 years, that employed generations, that sold fire engines to New York and sawmills to Chile, and that ended not with a catastrophe, but with an auction, a dumpster, and a retired man loading boxes into his car in a Brantford parking lot because someone had to remember.